Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I am here today with one of my colleagues, Rachel and Jaysa. She's an HR generalist with Acuity HR Solutions. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, Jaysa. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. For those of you that don't know, Acuity is an HR consulting firm located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And if you're curious about the areas that we focus on, you can visit our website, www.acuityhr.ca, or you can follow us on LinkedIn. But today we're talking about a very important topic. There have been some important changes that have happened at the federal level for organizations that are federally regulated with respect to violence and harassment prevention policies. So we thought we would provide some content and some context to these changes as a deadline to make change is approaching. So Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about what's happened with these changes?
Yeah, so essentially this new legislation puts into place and kind of outlines the various policies and procedures that federally regulated employers need to put into place in order to prevent harassment and violence in the workplace. And like you mentioned, the deadline is approaching. It comes into effect January 1st, 2021, so in a little less than a month. Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate as well that it does only impact federally regulated employers. So anybody provincially regulated would have to follow the provincial regulations. This just impacts, the banking industry, telecommunications, radio, logistics, transportation, some of those industries. So just for federally regulated employers.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great clarification. And there certainly has been a lot more outlined now as to what employers need to cover. It was fairly lean previously, and so there's a lot more that's required. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the new regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, like you mentioned, a lot outlined compared to what there was previously. I would say there are kind of 5 key components that employers will need to consider in order to align with the new legislation. So the first key component would be workplace assessments. So employers are responsible to identify potential hazards or risks of violence or harassment within the workplace, and then implement preventative measures to mitigate those risks. So that's kind of the first key component. The second key component is really putting into place that harassment violence prevention policy. And the legislation is very specific around what needs to be included within the policy. Everything from the respective roles of the employer, the health and safety committee or rep, the employees, the person designated to handle complaints or respond to complaints within the organization. And then it goes through, the resolution process. So there's a list of things that need to be included within that policy outlined within the legislation. The third key component would be the training piece. So employers are required to train all employees within the organization on the policy and how to, identify and respond to harassment or violence in the workplace if they come across it. And that piece is interesting because employers are required to implement the training 3 months after the start date of a new employee. So anybody starting needs to receive the training within 3 months.
Okay.
There is a bit of a grace period for the first year. So anybody who was hired previous to January 1st, 2021, there's kind of a grace period. So the training needs to happen within 2021, not necessarily within the 3 months.
Okay.
But yeah, so that would be the third key component, the training component. And again, the legislation outlines what needs to be included within that training. The fourth key component is around reporting. So there's an annual report that employers need to provide to the minister outlining any incidents, essentially like statistics around incidents within the workplace. So there's a component of the legislation that talks about the reporting requirements and the records that need to be kept. And then the fourth piece, and probably the largest piece of the policy or of the legislation, runs through the resolution process. And if there is an occurrence of violence or harassment within the workplace, how the employer is required to respond to that. So yeah, and the legislation goes through all the steps of what that might look like.
Definitely.
So those are kind of the five key pieces of the legislation that employers would need to consider.
Okay, that makes sense. You talked a little bit about the training side of things. What might that entail? Like, how might an employer, based on the legislation, follow that requirement?
Yeah, so it could look different. Either an organization could develop some internal training. There are requirements in terms of the qualifications that the trainer needs to have. So if there's somebody internally qualified, then that would certainly be an option. Of course, there are external providers like ourselves that do this sort of training as well. They're given the need to train new employees relatively quickly after they come on board. I think online or virtual training options are certainly worth considering for organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially given the nature of current landscape and how things are playing out in the workplace that way, there's a lot of things needing to go virtual regardless. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. Okay. What else should people know in terms of these changes? Anything related to just how incidents are being responded to, and how employers really have to play their part in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk a little bit more about the resolution process and what that might
Sure.
look like for an organization according to the legislation. So essentially, the legislation outlines, a variety of things in terms of that process, from how to make a complaint and how employees should proceed with a complaint or a notice of occurrence if they notice something happening, if they witness it, or if it happens to themselves. So there's a lot within the legislation around that complaint process. Very detailed around how the person who receives the complaint needs to respond. There's timelines and timeframes kind of that are part of that as well. And then there are essentially three potential methods for resolution that could occur. So the first method for resolution is called negotiated resolution, and so that would occur, or a complaint would be considered resolved if both the principal party, who is the person who is essentially the victim of the alleged victim of the violence or harassment, if that person and the employer can look at the complaint and come to the determination that the incident doesn't amount to harassment and violence as defined in the code, then you might resolve the complaint by negotiated resolution. So that would be the first method. The second method is conciliation. So if the principal party and the responding party, or the alleged harasser, can agree to a conciliator and meet with a conciliator and resolve that way, that's also an option.
Okay.
And then the third piece would be the investigation process. So if the principal party would like to proceed with investigation, then that's something that the employer will have to do. And again, there's quite significant guidelines around who can investigate and the qualifications required of an investigator. And it goes into a lot of detail about the investigation process, what the report should look like, who the report should be shared with, et cetera. There's a lot around the investigation piece as well. So that's essentially the resolution process and kind of the three resolution options that are outlined within the legislation.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. For some employers, I'm sure this might be new information. This might be something that they haven't heard of before, or maybe they've only loosely heard about, and understanding that now the requirement is to really make a robust effort and action towards violence and harassment prevention. That can be a daunting task and a bit of a tall order. But what would you say to organizations out there that are trying to grasp and understand the importance of this?
I would certainly recommend, either, having somebody internally kind of get a really good sense of the legislation and really understand it in order to put together a policy, or reach out, to an external provider that might be able to assist with the policy piece and the training piece and perhaps the workplace assessment piece as well. But yeah, I would definitely recommend that employers get on this ASAP, given that the deadline is fast approaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's just about understanding too that this is in the best interest of your people. We want to make sure
Mhm.
that a respectful workplace and one that is free of violence and harassment, that's a baseline. Like we have a lot of clients that want to go the extra mile and go to those extra steps of engagement and really having successful teams. But if you're not satisfying the baseline requirements of having a safe and respectful workplace, then you're really missing the boat as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And, certainly horrible implications on individuals if they deal with any of this stuff within their workplace. It's, yeah, not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we think about the people that are involved from a victim standpoint, but also those that have to take time out of their work life in order to support these sorts of scenarios. It's not ideal when organizations have to go under the investigation route and kind of go that way. We've seen a lot of circumstances where not only people are impacted, but of course organizations as a whole, from a brand and corporate culture standpoint, are impacted. And policies don't solve everything. We know that, but at the same time, too, there are now some very robust guidelines that can support organizations in creating um, a safe environment if this isn't already in place. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And ideally, ideally there are no harassment or violence complaints or occurrences, but yeah, definitely helpful to have kind of the baseline in place and to have the training in place for employees so they know what to do if it does happen.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing some of this. Again, I know there's a lot more to this that's involved, and we've been working with clients already on this to ensure that organizations are meeting that deadline. And so, if your organization is looking for some support in this area, this is certainly something that we can help with. Further to that, too, on the respectful workplace training side of things, that's another area that we can support in. And also, too, ultimately, if there is a circumstance of a workplace investigation that needs to occur, that also is another area of expertise that our firm Acuity HR does support clients with. So if any of those areas are of interest to you to chat further on, you can again feel free to reach out to us on our website, www.acuityhr.ca, and certainly follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube to hear more about content that may be relevant to your organization.